All right, I think we'll just get started on our intro slides as the last few folks start to join us. But good evening. Thank you for joining us tonight for our Wednesday webinar series on this forest plan revision. Tonight, we're going to be talking about planning for species diversity. Next slide. So just our agenda for this evening. First, just a couple introductions. We're going to cover some ground rules and some Zoom tips. We're going to jump into the webinar presentation, which will be followed with a question and answer session. So just for some introductions of the facilitators for the webinar this evening. I am Erin Matthews. I'm the Tongass Revision Plan Coordinator on the Forest. And we also have Erin Lynn Nesser. She's the Senior Planner with the Pacific Planning Service Group, which is also part of the Forest Service. And they are assisting the Tongass National Forest with this revision effort. So just some meeting ground rules. This meeting is being recorded and will be posted to our revision website. And you'll see this QR code a lot to guide you to that revision website if you haven't already visited. Closed captioning will be available on the recorded version. And if everyone can keep their microphones off during the duration of the meeting until the Q&A session, at which time we can raise our hands and unmute and ask questions that way. And any of the questions that are asked tonight will be addressed during the question and answer session at the end of our presentation. So just some Zoom tips and tricks. Some of us are not as familiar with Zoom. There is the Q&A button to submit questions to the revision team about this presentation at any time during the meeting. The chat will be used for relevant website links and mailing addresses. And if you experience any technical issues, you can definitely reach out to us through the chat as well. And like I mentioned, during our Q&A session, if you do want to unmute yourself to ask the question verbally, you just go to that raise hand feature, which is sometimes hidden under the reactions face there, just the arrow next to it, so you can do so. All right, without further ado, I want to introduce Gretchen Yaley. She is the Species Portfolio Supervisor for the Pacific Planning Service Group, and she's going to be presenting tonight. We also do have our forest planner from the Tongass, Alex Dunn, who will also be available during our Q&A session for any additional questions. So with that, I'll hand it off to you, Gretchen.
Thanks so much, Erin. Well, hello. As Erin said, my name is Gretchen Yaley. I work for the Forest Service. I'm a wildlife biologist and environmental planner with the Pacific Planning Services Group. And I'm going to be talking with you about species diversity and at-risk species in forest plan revision. The goals for this presentation are to define the categories of at-risk species and why they are important to forest plan revision, explain the process that we use for identification of the at-risk species that are species of conservation concern and how this relates to forest plan revision, and answer questions related to the process for these at-risk species. The topics that I'm covering today regarding species diversity are relevant for all of the planning framework and procedures that you see here. This is harkening back to some of our earlier webinars. So species diversity is relevant for the role of science, relevant during the assessment phase. We engage with the public, and we also will have monitoring related to species diversity. This also contributes directly to 3 of the 4 2012 planning rule requirements, including sustainability, diversity of plant and animals, and multiple use. This is one of the processes that we call parallel processes because it's going on at the same time as the overall forest plan revision process. This slide depicts how the various phases of the species of conservation concern process align and continue throughout the forest plan revision process. So the main points that we'll be going over are that forest plans ensure species diversity through conserving ecosystem conditions to provide for the persistence of species. At-risk species include federally listed species and species of conservation concern, and we'll talk a bit more about each of those. And identification of species of conservation concern is an important part of ensuring species diversity. So what are at-risk species? Generally speaking, at-risk species include those plant and animal species that are imperiled or in danger of extinction throughout all or a significant part of their range. This slide shows some of the at-risk species in the southeastern United States, a May white azalea and a frosted flatwoods salamander that are found in Region 8 of the Forest Service. To maintain the diversity of plant and animal species, we look closely at all at-risk species. The assumption that we make is that if we are providing ecosystem conditions for species that are imperiled, we are also providing conditions for species that are stable and have more general habitat needs. Categories of at-risk species recognized in the Forest Service include federally recognized species and regional forester designated species. Federally recognized species are designated by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service or the National Marine Fisheries Service under the Endangered Species Act of 1973. Species of conservation concern are designated by the regional forester through regulations and policies associated with the National Forest Management Act of 1976 and the 2012 Forest Planning Rule. We use these to avoid actions which may cause a species to become threatened or endangered and to be proactive in their conservation. The Species of Conservation Concern policy aims to keep species from becoming threatened or endangered under the Endangered Species Act. So forest plans must contribute to the recovery of federally listed threatened and endangered species, conserve proposed and candidate species, and maintain a viable population of each species of conservation concern within the plan area. A viable population is one that continues to persist over the long term with sufficient distribution to be resilient and adaptable to stressors and likely future environments. To be considered an SCC to be identified as a species of conservation concern, species must not be federally recognized under the Endangered Species Act. They must be native and known to occur within the plan area. There must be substantial concern about the species' capability to persist in the plan area. And as I said, these species are identified by the regional forester. So native and known to occur plus substantial concern are the criteria we use to identify a species as a species of conservation concern. Under the current 1997 Tongass Forest Plan, which was revised in 2016, we use regional forester sensitive species rather than species of conservation concern. And during this forest plan revision process, we will be shifting to species of conservation concern. This slide provides an overview of key differences between species of conservation concern and regional forester sensitive species. So now I'm going to talk about the process for identifying species of conservation concern. First, we determine which species potentially meet the criteria to be identified as species of conservation concern, and then we evaluate them further to determine which species will be carried forward into the revision of the forest plan. After we've identified species of conservation concern, we continue on with developing plan content, determining whether additional plan content is needed for the species and developing that species-specific plan content only when necessary. The species-specific plan content is content intended to provide a safety net for those species whose specific habitat needs or other life history requirements may not be fully met under ecosystem plan components. I also want to note that plan components can be included, even for species not identified as being at risk. I will now describe some more details about the identification process. This process is currently underway for Tongass Forest Plan revision. So there are two groups of species that we consider. There are those that must be considered and those that should be considered. And we consider all of the species that fall into either of those groupings. The species that must be considered reflect species in the highest risk categories, including species that are ranked globally as critically imperiled or imperiled, as well as species that were previously listed as threatened or endangered under the Endangered Species Act and have been delisted within recent years. Species that fall into the grouping of should consider reflect species in the next risk category. So species that are globally ranked as vulnerable, species ranked by the state as critically imperiled or imperiled, and also species that are classified as threatened or endangered or high priority based on rankings from the state, tribes, or Alaska Native corporations. And again, we evaluate all of the species in the must consider and should consider groups. All of the species that must or should be considered are evaluated further, first being screened for occupancy. Is the species native and known to occur within the plan area? If not, then that species will not be identified as a species of conservation concern. If the species is native and known to occur in the plan area, then the species carries forward to the next screen to see if it is already federally listed. As I said earlier, federally listed species that are threatened, endangered, candidate, or proposed are not species of conservation concern. These are at-risk species, but they're not SCCs. Species that are not federally listed but are native and known to occur then go through this final screening process to evaluate whether there is substantial concern. The acronym BASI stands for Best Available Scientific Information. And species with substantial concern are those for which the best available scientific information indicates substantial concern for the long-term persistence of the species within the plan area. If there is not substantial concern, then the species will not be identified as an SCC. If there is, then that species will be on the species of conservation concern list for the Tongass National Forest. A lot of terminology to understand here, so I will describe these three concepts in more detail. Occupancy, substantial concern, and best available scientific information. So occupancy pertains to whether a species occurs in a plan area. Native species are those that are or were present and originated in the area through natural, migratory, or evolutionary processes. It does not include species that have been accidentally or intentionally introduced. For a species to be known to occur, we have observation records that are precise enough to know that the species has been found within the plan area boundary. The species must also be established or becoming established to be known to occur. Extirpated species, those no longer occurring on the forest, and those that are accidental, transient, or well outside of their normal range would not be considered known to occur. Substantial concern. How do we assess whether the best available scientific information indicates substantial concern? One method that helps us differentiate whether there's substantial concern for species persistence in the plan area is to use weight of scientific evidence. We consider all of the things we know about a species and make a judgment about the overall balance of that information. Multiple factors bear on whether there is substantial concern, and the influence of each factor depends on the needs of the species. Threats and stressors may affect the species directly or affect habitat availability. Other elements that may lead to substantial concern include a small population, a declining trend in the population or in the habitat, poor dispersal ability of the species, or low reproductive capacity. Each of these factors needs to be considered together to determine whether there is substantial concern overall for the species to persist within the plan area. When we talk about best available scientific information, these are some of the various sources of information that we use when looking to find what is best available. This slide shows one of our sources of information, Forest Service maintained data sets. This shows spatial data where species are confirmed to occur. This is actual data for red cockaded woodpecker, an endangered species on the Francis Marion National Forest, and also trends in the species occupancy over time. So what makes the data best available scientific information? The 2012 planning rule defines best available scientific information as the subset of available data that are accurate, reliable, and relevant. Accuracy has elements of reducing bias and increasing precision. Reliability reflects how appropriately the scientific methods have been applied and how consistent the resulting information is with established scientific principles. Relevance refers to scientific information that is pertinent to the issues being considered at the appropriate spatial and temporal scales. This slide also shows that best available scientific information can come from many various sources, both internal and external to the Forest Service. All of these sources are screened to ensure that the information that we use in determining the criteria for species of conservation concern is the best available scientific information. Next, I will provide several examples of species evaluated on other forests based on species of conservation concern criteria to demonstrate some of these concepts that I have explained. While these are not examples from the Tongass, my hope is that describing how the identification criteria apply to example species will make this process easier to understand. This first example is Shockley's milkvetch, a plant that occurs on the Inyo National Forest. At the global level, it is rated as apparently secure. At the subspecies level, it is vulnerable, and at the state level, this plant species is imperiled. So this is a species with threats that should be considered. Consideration of the best available scientific information demonstrates the rarity of this species. There were only 17 records in the entire California Natural Diversity Database, and 10 of those records, 10 of the 17, occur on the Inyo National Forest. In addition to its rarity, this species has known threats related to mining and grazing activities, as well as competition from invasive plant species. Furthermore, this species has a limited distribution on the Inyo National Forest, occurring only in pinyon juniper and xeric shrub habitats. Therefore, we determined that there is substantial concern for the persistence of this species due to its rarity, limited distribution, and the immediate direct threats. The best available scientific information therefore supports identification of Shockley's milkvetch as an SCC on the Inyo National Forest. Another example is the black-backed woodpecker, a species that occurs in California and has a state ranking in California of imperiled. There have been prior petitions for listing the black-backed woodpecker, both at the federal and at the state level in California, suggesting known threats and declines. And there is substantial public interest regarding the species. We know that this species has a strong preference for ecological conditions associated with burned forests because they forage on larvae of insects that thrive in recently burned forests. Large wildfires, therefore, create excellent conditions for the black-backed woodpecker, and post-fire salvage logging can remove some important habitat components for this species. On the Inyo National Forest, forest data indicated that 552 detections had been observed within the national forest boundary, and there was no indication of a population decline. This contrasted with the data from the California Natural Diversity Database, which contains only 3 records of black-backed woodpecker within the Inyo National Forest boundary. The state database had been used in determining the state imperiled ranking may be incorrect due to inadequate data. The information specific to the Inyo National Forest is more reliable than the information that was available in the statewide database. Furthermore, burned forest habitat on the Inyo National Forest is stable or increasing. Therefore, the best available scientific information about the black-backed woodpecker does not indicate substantial concern about the species' capability to persist on the Inyo National Forest based on several factors, including large number of confirmed detections within the plan area, adequate burned forest habitat, and high potential for continued wildfires and creation of burned forest habitat. I've shared 2 examples of species that had adequate best available scientific information, and now I will describe how we address insufficient information. A species that has insufficient information cannot be identified as a species of conservation concern. So how much data is enough? We almost always have gaps in our knowledge about any given species. This isn't usually a problem because we normally know enough about some aspects to determine whether there's substantial concern. For example, we might know quite a bit about distribution, habitat, and threats, but not about population trends or dispersal capabilities. It might be enough to determine that there is substantial concern if we know that a species has a very limited distribution and its habitat is declining. There's no single or simple answer for every situation, but critically evaluating the weight of evidence is the process that we use. Demonstrating one more example to show what I mean by insufficient information. This is an example from Region 1 on the Flathead National Forest in Montana. Global rankings for this millipede indicate that it is imperiled. However, there's different tolerances for completeness of data in different conservation ranking systems. For this millipede, there is uncertainty regarding taxonomic status, and there was a lack of recent observations on the local forest. Also, we were lacking in information on life history or habitat associations. So the trends were unknown, the threats were unknown, and the taxonomic status was uncertain. So based on the criteria in the 2012 rule, this species was not identified as an SCC for the Flathead National Forest due to uncertainty regarding occurrence, status, and trends. The forest documented the uncertainty in the project record and remains open to new data that are accurate, reliable, and relevant for this species on the forest. Now that I've provided you with a few examples, you may be wondering where we are in the SCC identification process on the Tongass. Right now, we are determining which species meet the criteria to be identified as SCCs. The species of conservation concern process will run throughout the plan revision process and include outreach to tribes, governments, institutions, and communities through each step. The Alaska Regional Forester will identify potential SCC based on the findings in the written evaluations and input gathered through outreach. As I said earlier, after we determine which species meet the criteria to be SCCs, we will determine whether plan content needs to be developed for each of the species. Plan components developed during forest plan revision can also be included for species not identified as at risk. As an example, the forest may decide to develop plan content relevant for species important for subsistence and hunting, species such as deer, moose, caribou, bear, or salmon, as well as other species. So to say this another way, we will develop plan content as needed for each at-risk species, and we may include plan content for additional species beyond those classified as at risk where necessary. So to summarize, at-risk species include federally listed species and species of conservation concern. Identification of species of conservation concern is an important part of maintaining species diversity. Plan content will be developed during forest plan revision to provide conditions to support the long-term persistence of plant and animal species, and there will be opportunities for public engagement throughout forest plan revision. Thank you for your time and attention, and I look forward to hearing your questions and providing responses.
Thank you, Gretchen. All right, so we're going to move into our question and answer session. So just as another reminder, you can put those into the Q&A button there on your screen to type in your question. Or if you want to ask a verbal question, just please raise your hand and then I'll call on you so you can unmute and ask Gretchen your question directly. Would help if I had the right window open. Go ahead, Paul.
Yeah, hi, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Great, yeah, so my question is kind of related to thinking of species of concern in the context of the Tongass ecosystem, because most of the national forest here is an island archipelago. And so that creates kind of different risks for many of our endemic species relative to a lot of forest inhabitants in the lower 48. So how are we gonna think about that specific piece? I'm thinking like, chapter 8 of On the Origin of Species, Darwin always says be really careful on islands. So yeah, I just wanted to get a sense of how you're thinking of the unique nature of island ecosystems in this process.
Sure. Yes, I understand what you're getting at there, and island ecosystems, it contributes to, as you were mentioning with endemic species, the rarity. I mean, a species can exist on an island and be quite stable if the population is stable and the habitat is stable on the island. Rarity alone is not substantial concern, but being rare and facing threats, trends in their population or trends in their habitat is what we'd be looking at. I do understand what you're talking about in terms of islands, because of the isolated nature of islands, that can contribute to making it harder for species to disperse adequately. And that's definitely something we take into consideration.
All right, we'll read the question that came up in the QA next. Will the 1997 conservation strategy be maintained in the new forest plan?
The 1997 conservation strategy for what? For a specific, is it for a specific species?
It didn't specify. I didn't know if Alex, you also might wanted to respond to that, or?
Yeah, I can address that briefly, and then I'd say this is probably a good one to do our homework on so we get a consistent answer for everybody. But I can assume that the 1997 conservation strategy refers to the old growth conservation strategy. And because the old growth conservation strategy, I believe, was carried forward with the 2016 amendment, it didn't change significantly at that point in time, but you know, in theory, everything's on the table with this revision. But then one of the next steps in our process after we do our forest assessment will be to identify any needs for change in the current plan. So I guess on a more general level, it's possible that it could be carried forward into the new plan without much change, but it's also possible that based on the process and feedback and environmental analysis that we tweak it in some way.
Thank you, Alex. I think Winston, I think you also have your hand up.
Well, I was going to help with the response to the question that the first person asked. The wildlife conservation strategy was part of the forest plan in terms of providing an overall landscape conservation plan to help maintain biological diversity. So it wasn't for a given species. It was part of the framework, and included things like the old growth reserves and other elements of that. That was one of the things that I wanted to respond to. The other thing I wanted to suggest is I disagree with the comment that says rarity does not mean that a species is at risk. Rarity of species that are rare are at greater risk of genetic drift and inbreeding that will lead to reduced population viability over time. Now, rarity, that's a kind of a general term, and it can be relative depending upon the size of the area, but certainly populations that are relatively small are at risk, regardless of whether the habitat has been modified much at all or not. My question is, what do you define as an ecosystem? The gentleman who talked about the archipelago, that's an incredibly important point, and it each island can represent an entire ecosystem, and so I think it's important to understand what your definition of ecosystem is, so that we can then understand better what you mean by an SCC, and whether the intentions of maintaining ecosystems that are stable will in fact accomplish what you suggest. Thank you.
Certainly, yeah, thanks for that question. And in terms of how we define ecosystem, that's something that I'm not going to read off verbatim here, but I am going to make sure that we look into getting the correct wording for you and post it along with this webinar recording. I heard your comment about rarity, and what I'm suggesting is that rarity alone, so rarity contributes to substantial concern, and rarity alone is not equivalent to substantial concern. So I hope that helps to clarify the point that I was making.
Thank you.
All
Certainly.
right, thank you, Winston, for that. Jen, you have your hand up.
Oh, thanks so much, Erin. And thanks for your presentation, Gretchen. I'm here on Prince of Wales, and one of the species that gets talked a lot about here is Alexander archipelago wolves, of course. And recently there's been a lot of data that was recently collected and analyzed as part of the third petition to list to get an ESA listing for wolves. And I know there's some fish and wildlife folks on the call here too, which is great. So I know that a lot of work went into that and that decision last year that the listing wasn't warranted. I do hear questions when I attend the community workshops here, and when species or when this particular question is or component of the plan is being discussed, that You know, I've heard folks have questions about that, about how those processes relate and how much of the information and data that was collected through the recent assessment that the service did will get pulled into the plan. And can you speak a little bit more specifically about that, especially since it's just the first thing that comes to mind where there was a lot of work done recently? How does that information get incorporated? Thank you.
Yes, certainly. Thanks for that question. And yes, the best available scientific information that I was talking about, that process for filtering out and seeking the information that is accurate and relevant. Certainly the information that would be in the species status assessment report for a petition to list would be the BASI, if those are these recent petitions to list, that same information that has been compiled by the Fish and Wildlife Service, even if the decision was made not to list the species, that a lot of the relevant information about the species needs and trends for the species and trends for the habitat will be contained in there. And I do want to just reemphasize again what I was talking about tonight. Both I was really focusing on the process for identification of SCCs, but I hope that you all heard me mention a couple of times that the identification of a species as an SCC or not as an SCC is only a part of this process of forest plan revision. And as we are ensuring species diversity, we do that through a combination of plan components that affect ecosystem integrity and plan components that address specific needs of individual at-risk species and also other species, whether they're at risk or not, right? So anyhow, I think your question had to do with the information gathered and compiled for those petitions and reviews for federal listing. Is that correct, Jen? And if so, yes, all that information would carry forward for this process.
Thanks for that, Gretchen. And then do you anticipate that there would still be data gaps beyond that, or would the really thorough information included in that assessment be considered adequate? Like how much, and I'm sure this is unique to different species, but like what could the public's expectation be around additional research needs for this particular species?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I don't have an answer for you on what the data gaps might be. But that is something that we certainly can, again, address and post if there are additional data gaps. I would say that oftentimes a species that has been through a process like this a process such as a petition to list has quite a bit of information that I would say that insufficient information isn't usually the challenge with those species.
Okay, well, I think that's kind of consistent with the the public feedback I'm hearing too about that. So that's helpful. Thank you. And Erin, just wanted to flag that for you as well. I don't know if you're hearing that in meetings that you're attending, but that certainly, tends to be, I think, where a lot of people's minds go for that particular part of the presentation. So all of this helps us better communicate to the public about the work that you're doing. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Jen, for bringing that up. Another question from the Q&A. Can a species be added once the plan is adopted? Climate change creates unpredictable changes. Will the plan be flexible to address this?
Yes. Yes, species can be added to the list outside of the forest plan revision process. And also if there is a need to amend the plan, then a plan can also be amended through an administrative change. So there would not be a need to wait until future forest plan revision to make a change to the species of conservation concern list.
All right, one more question real quick from the Q&A, and then I'll go to you, Paul. Does SCC evaluation occur continuously or only during a forest plan revision? So I think you just answered this one.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly during forest plan revision. Right now, we are evaluating all of the species known to occur that fall into those bins that I described, the must and should consider species. If new information is gleaned or new species are newly detected, then we evaluate that need as the information comes in.
Thank you, Gretchen. Paul, you had another question?
Yeah, thank you, Aaron. I tuned in a little bit late, so I missed the first part of the presentation, but my question basically pertains to salmon. They're not only are they important to human uses here, but they drive the distribution of many large mammals and feed everything from small mammals to wolves and bald eagles. So I'm curious, have you started thinking about whether to analyze changes to existing salmon management? And by that, I mean protections for class 3 and class 4 non-anadromous streams that really control downstream water quality. Larger riparian buffers, we have 300-foot buffers in many Pacific Northwest forests. And there's a lot of science that says that would be a valuable asset here for a lot of wildlife populations. And there's a host of other things, but those two things stand out. So are you thinking about changing standards and guidelines for salmon?
Yeah, thanks for that question. And that leads back into what I was commenting on in terms of both ecosystem integrity. That's central to the 2012 rule, is focusing on ecosystems. The idea is having functioning ecosystems with strong integrity and resilience is going to provide habitat for the majority of native species expected to be on the forest. So I don't know the specifics about the standards and guidelines pertaining, as you're commenting on, with the riparian buffers. Alex, I don't know if you want to comment on that, but I just want to emphasize again that the question, we obviously recognize the importance of salmon, and whether or not any salmon species is classified as a species of conservation concern, making sure that we have ecosystems that support salmon is certainly something that will be important in this forest plan revision. Alex, do you have anything to add to that?
Well, on a more general level, yeah, I think it's a great question to illustrate that the 2012 planning rule tries to get at this species diversity requirement and ensure persistence of native species through both the species specific approach, which is how SCC approaches it, as well as a more broad ecosystem integrity mandate. So there's a substantive requirement in the rule that all plans must provide for this ecosystem integrity. And at the same time, we also want to look at a species by species level and come at that question of, do we need to have plan direction, standards and guides, like you say, being some of the more familiar plan components that conserve these species. So I think all that to say that I do think SCC will ultimately result in us asking that question. Does the current plan direction provide for the ecological conditions for SCC and other native species to persist, or do we need to potentially consider changes to them? So I just wanted to point out that that SCC process ultimately is designed to help answer those questions that you're asking, or similar ones.
All right, we have another question. What is your criteria for determining which information is more reliable in determining a CC?
Yeah, I wouldn't really say that it's more reliable. For best available scientific information, the criteria are the data accurate? Are the data reliable? And are the data relevant? And I guess I feel like in terms of accuracy and reliability, those are more I don't know that it's a matter of what's more reliable or what's less reliable. It's a question of whether the information source is a reliable information source. I think that something like relevancy, something can be more or less relevant if you're comparing two different pieces of information, but a reliable piece of information is going to be used and contribute to the weight of evidence as we're assessing substantial concern.
All right, well, we wait for additional comments to come in. And could you advance to the next slide, Gretchen?
Sure.
Just want to highlight just a few things, and then Winston, I saw that you just put another chat or question. So just want to make sure to highlight our plan revision website. If you haven't for our email updates, please do so. This is a screenshot from the website where you can put your email address in there to get signed up for all the deliveries of those email blasts that will announce comment periods and engagement opportunities. So please do so if you haven't already, and that QR code directs you there too. Any questions, any feedback, you can also send directly to our plan revision inbox at tongassplanrevision@usda.gov. Next slide. And then we're almost done with this suite of Wednesday webinars. We do have one more next week on planning for resource use and revision. But again, these are all recorded on our plan revision webpage under the media library. And just so it's not too confusing, the question and answers are posted just on the main engagement page under Q&A from our past engagements. Next slide. Community workshops are going on right now. So please find when the community workshop in your area is happening so you can engage on all the different parts of this plan revision process and the vision, the trends, everything that makes up the Tongass. And we really appreciate not only you attending here, but to get that feedback from you as well. Next slide. We do have a revision office hours as well with Erin, Lynn, and myself. So if you want to pin us down at a certain time, they are currently happening 2 times a month. The first Tuesday of the month in the morning from 10 to 11, and then the third Tuesday of the month from 5 to 6 p.m. So just another opportunity to engage with us, and those links are also on our engagement page. Next slide. And I just want to highlight this because there's lots of buttons on the website. So the engagement opportunities are under the Get Involved section. And that's where our Q&As go when we have those compiled and ready to go. They get posted there. And then our webinar recordings are found under the Media Library. So good information available under our document library for your reading as well. Next slide. If you are not able to go to those community workshops, as our partner Spruce Root did put together a feedback form where you can provide some of that input. Again, you can always email us directly to our revision plan inbox, but this is just another opportunity for you. If you go to our community workshops, you'll be able to provide tons of feedback on all sorts of different topics and subjects, but this is just a different avenue if you're not able to go to those in-person opportunities. But I apologize, Winston, I didn't catch your comment before I started talking. Winston just wanted to follow up with what you were saying, Gretchen, when you're talking about reliable and sources. He said, what if there is conflicting information?
Yeah, that's a good question. So the best available scientific information is a way for us to screen and filter out for accuracy and relevancy. When there's conflicting science, that is something that we take a closer look at. We describe that in our process. That is something that occurs where different scientists don't agree. So if there's actually disagreement among scientists, that is something that we will discuss and divulge, and we will explain, this is one school of thought and this is another school of thought. These are the strengths of this argument, the strengths of that argument, and then describe, how we've come to our conclusion about what is the most relevant given circumstances relevant for the Tongass National Forest. So that is something we certainly do see. And I don't know how to describe it more fully than that, but I wouldn't say that we're looking at, as I said, the accuracy and the reliability are more of a filter whether something is or is not. And the relevance is more of a relative term. And yes, if there's differences of opinion, that is something that we have to delve a bit more deeply into and describe more fully.
Thank you.
All right, I'm not seeing any other questions queued up. Does anyone else have any questions at this time? Erin Lynn did put in those URLs or the website links for everything that I zoomed through on the slides. So you're welcome to check those out with the different parts of our revision webpage, our email addresses, as well as that Spruce Root survey. And again, we'll be putting all these question and answers up on our website as soon as we can get it up there. Sometimes I might take a week, so just be patient with me. I will get it up there. But that is all that we have prepared for you this evening. We'll stick around for a few more minutes to see if there's any straggler questions, but we really appreciate your time and engaging with us. And this is just the beginning. This is, we're just providing you the information on these different parts of the assessments. So engagement is going to continue because this is not a quick process for plan revision. So there'll be many more engagement opportunities to come. So please stay with us as we continue down this road.